My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now, in its 24th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs are meant to illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism through time, and stories of resistance against injustice. Today, we are honored to be joined by Hasia Diner and Daniel Okrent. Hasia is the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History and Director of the Goldstein-Gorin Center for American Jewish History at New York University. She's the author of numerous books, including In the Almost Promised Land, American Jews and Blacks, 1915 to 1935, and Roads Taken, The Great Jewish Migrations to the New World and the Peddlers Who Forged the Way. Daniel Okrent is the prize-winning author of 6 books, including The Guarded Gate, Bigotry, Eugenics, and the Law That Kept 2 Generations of Jews, Italians, and other European immigrants out of America, The Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition, and Great Fortune, The Epic of Rockefeller Center. Among his many jobs in publishing, he was corporate editor-in-large at Time Inc. and was the first public editor of the New York Times. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Hasia and Dan. So if you want to turn your cameras back on. Awesome. Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us. So I'd like to begin by talking about the rates and trends in Jewish migration during the 19th and early 20th centuries. So from my understanding, during the first half of the 19th century, the majority of Jewish immigrants came from Central Europe and many were German speaking. But by the beginning of the 20th century, the majority of Jewish immigrants were from Eastern Europe. So can you talk a bit about the profile of these immigrants in both sort of ways?
Right, so thank you. Okay, and thank you for having me. The first part of your statement is certainly very accurate. I, however, think we need to push the East European migration much earlier than is conventionally assumed. And obviously, there's some question about what is Eastern Europe. These are not, clear categories or clear sort of nations. Obviously, they're not nation states. But in the 1850s, the first Russian Jewish congregation is opened in New York in 1852, and even a decade before that, many American Jewish communities, places in the Midwest and in New York and Philadelphia, Boston, had one or more Polish congregations. So it's a much earlier phenomenon, and the overlap was quite extensive. While without jumping the gun and not taking too much time, historians have really emphasized these as 2 really separate categories. They really were not. And in terms of the profile, young people unable to make a place for themselves in radically changing economies made the 2 very similar to each other.
Dan, do you have anything that you want to hop in with?
I mean, Hasia is much more the expert on this part of the story than I am. The only thing I would like to point out is that I think that we pay attention to things based on events. And each of to the degree you can separate them, the 1848 revolutions in Central Europe, that was an event that sent many people, not just Jews, away from the German-speaking part of Europe. And then in the later part of the 19th century, the pogroms. That's the event that we attach the sense of everything has changed and this is a new world that's arriving on our shores. And then also, I do think, and Hasia will correct me if I'm wrong about this, there's no question that there was friction between the groups.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I think the friction is as much that with each decade, with each new wave, as the numbers grew and grew, the newcomers confront people who are quite thoroughly American or who are already on the steps to America, and they could actually have come from Lithuania in the 1850s, but they're American Jews. And to the newcomers from, let's say, Ukraine or Moldavia, they kind of seem like they're German. Okay, but when you scratch the surface, they're not really. So yes, I mean, so there's friction, but again, there's such a tremendous class difference and language difference, and it was less German versus Russian as it was English versus Yiddish, Americanized versus just stepped down on the shores, and so they had very different interests in the outcome of events and policies and the like.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think before we sort of get a little bit more into sort of the Americanized Jews and that part of the story, I want to go back a little bit and go to what you said, Dan, maybe going into a bit about these immigrants' reasons for leaving Europe. I know, Dan, you mentioned the pogroms, but Hasia, I know in your book, The Jews of the United States, you discuss how Jews in Germany were subjected to a number of discriminatory laws and taxes. And can you delve into this a little bit more? And also, can you talk about if this was similar in other parts of Europe?
Right. So throughout Central Europe, and again, there's so many different states, principalities. These are not coherent nation states. It's really complicated to talk about any one of them as typical, but many of these jurisdictions had, for example, restrictions on Jewish marriage, and that Jews, a couple could not marry unless there was a sort of slot for them in a kind of communal, officially designated number of acceptable or registered Jewish households, and they were hampered in trade by restrictions that were specifically targeting Jews. And there was even violence. So we know 1819 and 1830 and 1848, there were all sorts of outbreaks of violence against Jews in as far west as Alsace and in Bavaria and in Bohemia. And they don't have the word pogrom attached to them. They lack that kind of drama, but I don't know, they didn't seem all that different. I think if you were getting clubbed over the head, I don't think you worried that it didn't have a name. But primarily for that first, again, the Jews coming in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, it was a heavily economically driven migration. Interestingly, because the restrictions on marriage, it was a much more single migration of single people than later when it's families. And these were often single men who, if they stayed home, could never marry. And they go off to America, which is a place where they can earn some money and then kind of contract for a bride or go back and get a bride. But if they stayed home, they couldn't marry. And that's like a pretty big life matter.
I think it's worth adding just that, I mean, everything that Hasia said is dead on, that this phenomenon of the single man coming over was not remotely confined to the Jews. In the Italian immigration, which was really the largest immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, that was a very, very common phenomenon. And a lot of them went back once they had a little bit of money. Now, the Jews weren't going to go back. They had reasons to stay in the U.S., and many of the Italians did not.
Right.
So, Dan, can you also then talk a little bit more about the pogroms that you mentioned beforehand and just how that may have changed the nature of immigration? And is there a way that we can sort of track how many people came because of this violence, or is that sort of impossible?
I don't think so. I think that Hasia got it right. It was a name that it was attached to something that had been happening. These official and unofficial, but often official, assaults on Jewish populations. It's after the assassination of the Tsar in 1881 or 1882 that there begins to be an official sense of something organized. I'm talking about in obviously in Eastern Europe. But as I said before, it's convenient to have a name, but that isn't the defining thing. The laws, the laws that limited the rights of Jews in the Russian Empire were horrible, and that you didn't need pogroms for that to be the case. That was just a more visible thing.
And I want to add to that what's interesting is that the 1881 pogroms, and then the ones, Kishinev in 1903 and Odessa, happen when there are already established Jewish populations in the United States and England, and they play a very important role in drumming up publicity for the suffering Jews of the Russian Empire, and in a way take what Dan has just described and spread it all over the newspapers and have rallies, and they get prominent non-Jews to speak at these rallies, and they create a whole body of discourse and speeches and poetry that are intended very specifically to rouse the public. And it's, in a sense, having those, quote, German Jews in the United States who are able to get, Theodore Roosevelt to come to a rally, to really ramp up the publicity for these events, and to make a case for the importance of the United States as a safety valve for the Jews of the Russian Empire, who the assumption is life will just be increasingly terrible for them, and they need to get out.
There's a lot of visual evidence, posters and the like, and obviously not the technology of the 20th, much less the 21st century, that remind me very much of the pleas for help that we get for feeding, starving people in an Asian or an African country. It's the sobbing woman with the child, and the implication that the husband is gone or has been killed. And these were to pull the American heartstrings. And it worked to a degree. Yeah,
and it worked partly for fundraising purposes. I mean, they want to send money there, but also to get the US government and the British government to be sympathetic and welcoming, and to again make the case. But these pictures are really heart-rending, and the rhetoric for example, in much of the press is the exact same one for each pogrom. You just kind of trot out the pogrom article, which doesn't at all minimize the horror of it, but they happened. They were terrible. I don't again say minimize them, but they were very much intended to as a way to garner sympathy for Jews.
So I think that actually partially answers my next question, but I do want to give you a chance to sort of expand on it. So, you mentioned that there were a lot of American Jews already kind of advocating for these Jews in Eastern Europe and Russia, but is there other reasons that Jews chose America as their new home, essentially, after leaving Europe?
Right. So I could start if you'd like.
Please do.
Okay. So it was a place of just expansive economic opportunity for white people, for people who had the capability of citizenship, which Jews did. It was the place, for somebody who had pretty much no prospects at home to make a go of it as peddler, shopkeeper, even work in the garment industry was a kind of elevator, a route to mobility. And there's no place in the world that came as close to the United States in terms of the dynamism of the economy. And as more and more Jews came, then there were more and more institutions and more communities and more friends from back home, from this town or that town, to make life, if not wonderful, at least livable. And I don't want to either dismiss the freedom of religion and the ability of Jews to create the kinds of communities that they wanted, and the privileges of political participation that were open to them, and all of those, and the fact that there were so many other immigrants coming, and Jews were hardly stigmatized as the immigrants. But yet it was economics. It was that dynamo of an economy just moving physically across the continent, the expansion of industry. Where else?
Yeah, well, relative to the moving across the continent, there is in the first decade of the 20th century, the Galveston Project, in which was an effort that was funded by Jacob Schiff, really to keep the immigrants away from New York, I believe. There were so many poor Jewish immigrants on the Lower East Side and various other places in the port cities, Philadelphia, Baltimore. Let's, kind of, maybe we can shove them off elsewhere. And this project didn't last a long time, but many thousands of Jews came in through Galveston. And those of you who are listening, if you are in Fort Smith, Kentucky, or Arkansas, or you're in Sioux Falls, or in any, the Jewish department store was usually often started by somebody who came in this way. And one of the things that happened, the immigration people who were handling it in Galveston, if you got off the boat and you were asked, what is your occupation? I'm a butcher. Oh, good. Kansas City needs a butcher. And there was even a job waiting for you.
And it's interesting. There was also an organization headquartered in New York called the Industrial Removal Office, which is such a terrible name, but it was nobody was forced to go there, but they would take requests from Jewish immigrants, men, say, are you willing, if you want a job, we're willing to send you to those same places, Sioux Falls and Paducah and Appleton, Wisconsin, and the IRO, also founded by Jacob Schiff, financed by Jacob Schiff, would set new immigrants up with like a place to live, a job. They relied on local Jewish communities, B'nai B'rith lodges or synagogues to help settle them. And so men who found they couldn't make it in New York, they found the competition in like the garment industry, in the sewing field, too tough. Maybe they just hated it, hated the crowding and the dirt and the noise. I said, okay, I'm willing to go. And so they too dispersed Jews to all these places, and some of which do grow into pretty thriving, small, but still vibrant Jewish communities.
You both are really great at providing segues for my next question, so thank you for that. So we talked about how there were Jewish communities spread all over the country, but there is still this sort of popular view that Jews came to the United States, settled in New York, lived in tenement buildings, and worked in the garment industry. So to what extent is that the case? And to what extent is that not?
Certainly early on, in the Eastern European, the huge wave of Eastern European immigration that comes, Ellis Island opens in 1892. It's New York. Where else are the Jews coming into the country? Baltimore, Philadelphia, I guess some in Charleston, which had a large Jewish community, or a substantial one at that point. In Boston, they went to where they arrived, and then, as Hasia explained, they moved through the country. I mean, my own grandfather arrived in New York. I don't know whether it was the IRO, but he was given the opportunity to get a job in Indianapolis, of all places. He comes from Eastern Poland. He gets sent to Indianapolis, and he has a job in a factory that is doing upholstery for horse-drawn carriages. And around 1917 or 1918, he realizes carriages, and he moves to Detroit.
Not a bad one.
Well, he saw his chance, and I think that's not an uncommon story of people moving around until they find the place where they are home.
But and the New York aspect of the question is not mythic. And the fact is, New York was the center of the garment industry. And there were garment factories in Baltimore, Rochester, Chicago, Philadelphia, but it was situated in New York. That was the heart of it. It was in the 1930s, the single largest industry in New York City. And it was primarily the entrepreneur, the owners of the factories were almost all Jews. And many of them were former East European immigrants who did well. And it's always, I go every year to the 100th anniversary, to the anniversary of the Triangle Fire. And, you know, the two owners, Harris and Blank, were both Lithuanian Jewish immigrants who had been sweatshop workers. And they saved up enough to become sweatshop owners. And then they saved up enough to, by the time of the founding of the company, was the single largest garment shop factory in New York. But that was not uncommon to have that for garment making to be a kind of both an elevator, but also to create a kind of Jewish ethnic economy and all the possible, I don't want to say negative, positive, but all the complexities of Jews working for other Jews. Okay, so unlike your grandfather who probably worked for Ford or Chrysler or one of those, most of the Jews in New York, and I think the 1905 New York State Census had 65% of all Jews working in the garment field. They're working for other Jews, and it gave them leeway to demand something from those employers, and it also gave the employer a kind of a little bit of a power over them as well. So it's very complicated, but New York really was the heart of it. And I say this as somebody who grew up in Milwaukee. So New York was like this kind of Jewish Mecca.
Hasia, how many Yiddish daily papers, Yiddish language daily papers were there in New York in 1920 or so, 1910?
By 1920, the number had already begun to go down. But a decade earlier, there were 8 or 9 of them.
Dailies.
Daily newspapers, and each one was different. So the Wahrheit was supported by Tammany, was paid for by Tammany Hall, and the Tageblatt was Orthodox, and the Tog was sort of Republican but Zionist, and so on. And in 1916, the Jewish Daily Forward was the largest circulating foreign newspaper in New York. And so a remarkable kind of output of literary and political culture in those papers.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I just want to go back for a second to something you said, Hasia. Can you just, for those who don't know, can you just briefly explain what the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was?
Okay, so March 1911, it still stands as the worst industrial accident in American history. And the girl, it's mostly women who worked in the factory. About a third of them were Italian, the other 2/3 were Jewish. A lot of them young, 16, 17 years old. They had to work a 5-day week. So it was Saturday morning, late morning. And as was typically the case, the employer locked the door from the outside. So first the girls wouldn't leave early, the workers wouldn't leave early, and they wouldn't sneak out. And secondly, they wouldn't steal swatches of fabric. And all sorts of possibilities as to how the fire started, but it may have been somebody smoking, or it may have been an electrical, a fritz in the electrical wires. But the fire went from the 7th to the 8th to the 9th floor, and they couldn't get out. Many of them were trampled to death as they all tried to run down the stairs, and many of the women jumped out the windows. And the fire company just didn't go high enough to for them to walk down. The next door was the NYU Law School, and they actually went out on the roof, and they were bringing the women up across the roof, but 147 fatalities.
Thank you for that. I just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So I think now that we've talked a little bit about sort of the immigrant experience, just a brief overview, I do want to talk a little bit about the reaction to immigration and Jewish immigration in the United States. So, there was an effort to Americanize immigrants once they came. So can you talk about what those efforts entailed and what that meant?
There's one specific case I'd like to cite that isn't terribly well
Sure.
known. It's about a man named Joseph Lee, who in Boston, who was considered the first citizen of Boston. He was an incredibly generous. He paid for the Boston schools to pay for the dentist to come in to take care of the children in the Boston schools. He sponsored international festivals. He was phenomenal. He also financed the most powerful anti-immigrant organization in the country, the Immigration Restriction League, which for 20 years was something that he almost personally bankrolled. So what is the conflict going on here between this man who is such a great social liberal and at the same time quite an angry anti-Semite? And the answer was, he was pretty frank about it in his correspondence. He said, I don't want them here, but once they're here, I want to turn them into Americans. And there were many, the settlement house movement is probably the best example, but that's just one very, I think, sharp one. And just as an afterthought, he has two grandchildren, great grandchildren, one who's married to a Jew and the other one's married to an Italian. So history comes home.
Sounds nice.
There you go.
Yeah, so I think, but partly in a way, thinking about that word or that phrase to Americanize the immigrants often has a sort of negative valence to it. But it was a recognition, certainly for Jewish immigrants, but for others as well, that for those people who were coming for good, those who were going to stay in a monolingual society, okay, learning English, being able to go out in the world and in the country and have skills of literacy and know how to navigate the world was absolutely crucial. And I think, we sometimes spend a lot of time thinking about the sort of harsh motives of the Americanizing agencies, but they were dealing with a very serious issue. As I hear all these hundreds of thousands, millions coming in, and how are they going to get work? How are they going to navigate society? What about their children if they didn't acquire those skills? And most of the Jewish agencies were involved also. So we could take the Yiddish press. I mean, it has articles on where to go to learn English and what's baseball, and to explain them an election coming up. Who are the candidates? Why should you vote for this one, not that one? Obviously, the Varheit always said vote Tammany, straight down the line. But these are all agencies of Americanization. And in fact, the first serious study of the Yiddish press was called the Yiddish Press and Americanizing Agency. And so even within its deep commitment to Yiddish was a notion that without Americanization, it was a recipe for disaster. And I should also say that a lot of the Americanization is informal, takes place on the streets. Jewish immigrant kids go out and they play with or rumble with or whatever, Italian immigrant kids. In 1970,
Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano.
Absolutely, they cooperate in crime. 1917, immigrant young men from all the communities, end up in the U.S. Army. And I mean, theirs were, kind of, and by the way, there were Americanization projects within the Army. Okay, so the Jewish Welfare Board runs English classes on the Army bases, so that these guys who have been drafted into the Army can cope linguistically. So I think it's actually a much more complicated word than we sometimes think. And
yeah,
I love the story of Lee.
Yeah, I think those are both really good points, and I think really important to keep both sides of that in mind. And, Hasia, as you pointed out earlier, in 1910, there were about 8 to 9 Yiddish publications in New York, and by the 20s, that had already gone down. So obviously, these efforts were starting to work. But how much how much did immigrants really buy into these efforts, and was there any pushback against that?
If they had children,
Yeah.
they became Americans. The children
Yeah.
went to American schools. They had American friends. My father was born here, didn't speak English until he was 6 years old. He lived in a totally Yiddish speaking community in Indianapolis, and then school made him an American.
Right. Yeah, and so for one thing, the decline of those dailies is not just because people were rejecting Yiddish, but the population is increasingly American born. And
Right.
so like Dan's father, and just as a statistic, in 1930, a slim majority, but a majority nonetheless of Jews in the United States were American born. So why would they read a Yiddish newspaper? Not that there's, and now there are these immigrant communities sponsor schools, Yiddish schools or Hebrew schools, which not that many schools went to. So it's not that the Americanizing was not in opposition to being Jewish. And there's an Orthodox congregation in Chicago that had like a little settlement house attached to it, Beth Jacob, and that's where Benny Goodman got his first clarinet lesson. And so, does that mean they didn't want him to be Jewish? No, I mean, it was an Orthodox synagogue, but yeah, I mean, they want the children to participate in American culture, and yeah, just by stepping into those schools. And the process happens. I should also say, by the way, the rise of the movies. I mean, the Nickelodeons, most of which in New York were located on the Lower East Side. What a powerful venue, sort of instrument of Americanizing and learning about all the ridiculous or not ridiculous aspects of American culture. And so pushback, I mean, I think one way we could know there was essentially no pushback is A, people didn't go back where they could, quote, be more Jewish. And secondly, the immigrants and their communities don't create all Jewish day schools. They don't want that. They want their kids to be able to function in American society and not be garment workers or not be peddlers, and want them to become teachers or social workers or business and so on, and lawyers. I didn't even want to throw that out. So to get into the professions and into the more comfortable ranks. Without English, none of that's going to happen.
In New York, that generation largely of young people born here, by 1918, there were so many who had been admitted to Columbia University that Columbia put in a quota. Because we're being overwhelmed by these Jews. These are the ones who are in the path of Americanization, straight to Morningside Heights, and Columbia and law school and medical school beyond it.
Right. And let's factor in the number who go to City College. I mean, and Hunter, and the women who go to Hunter. I mean, these are, by the 1920s, predominantly Jewish institutions. 70–80% of the students are Jewish. And so obviously something's clicking.
And just to move it out of New York, our tendency is to stay there for all sorts of good reasons. At Harvard in 1922, the president of Harvard, Lawrence Lowell, he wanted to put in a Jewish quota. And in his letter explaining this to a member of the Harvard board, he said, I don't want us to become what Columbia has become, very specifically. And of course, the way these things happened, Harvard did not institute a Jewish quota officially. They just kept Jews out.
My grandpa was actually one of the ones that went to City College, so that's interesting that you mentioned that, Hasia.
It was a kind of Jewish Mecca, and the descriptions of the it was all male, but of the guys who were there, particularly in the 30s is like, it was so Jewish, and it was so splintered by ideology that there'll be one corner which were only the Trotskyites in the lunchroom, and one corner only were the socialists, another corner were the Stalinists, another corner the anarchists, and it didn't have, there were almost no Jewish faculty. They didn't teach Jewish subjects, but nobody cared. They were coming there for very strategic reasons.
And one of the other draws, of course, is that City College was free.
Yeah.
If you're a poor immigrant family and you can't afford Columbia, City.
Yeah, it's actually an amazing phenomenon of a kind of marriage about New York and the Jews, that it's not only the center of the garment industry and the largest port of entry, but here's this free public institution of higher learning. And there were a few others. I think the University of Cincinnati may have been free. I think maybe Pittsburgh, but nothing to compare to City College, and then Hunter, which for women.
I think those are that's a really important point to keep in mind, that Americanization also has it's not just a negative thing. So I very much agree with that. But I think there was, I also want to move into sort of nativism and eugenics and that sort of backlash. But Dan, would you mind maybe explaining what nativism is and how it manifested during this time, and the major nativist leaders and what their rhetoric was?
Well, to me, the signal fact about the nativism, which is to say the anti-immigrant feeling that took hold in this country in the 19th and 20th century, although it had been there before, always goes away and it always comes back. It's inevitable. The Boston Brahmins, the wealthy Bostonians whose families had been in the US since the 1600s, referred to themselves as Native Americans, which is a little bit different from the way that the term is used today. And the point was to make the distinction between those of us who are American and those who are not. And it was a way of defining someone as an interloper and even as an enemy. And the leaders of the nativist movements, the various nativist movements, were very effective at their propaganda, so that it would spread to the point where in parts of the country where there were no immigrants, there was fear of immigrants because this was being taught to them. You mentioned eugenics, and if I could just leap into that. Eugenics was a basically bogus 19th century theory born in the UK that said that if you marry people with really good genes to each other, then we'll get a better society. And if we don't let the people with bad genes marry others, they didn't know the word genes at the time, they didn't know a lot, then we would have a bad society. And this took hold in the US in around 1902, 1903, begins to spread a little bit, primarily in scientific communities, but it was all about individuals. Let's not let Dan marry Hasia because Dan's got, he's stupid. And Hasia's got a good brain and we want her to marry someone.
No, the other way around.
Oh, please. But around 1912, there's a sudden change in the rhetoric that is then spread widely in a book published in 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race by a very wealthy New York aristocrat named Addison Grant, in which he applies these principles of eugenics not to individuals, but to ethnic groups. And he actually says in this book that there are three major ethnic groups, white ethnic groups, and they are the Nordics, who are tall and blonde and strong and brilliant and are the conquerors. Then the Alpines, who are a little bit shorter and a little bit, not as blonde. They're the next level down. And the bottom level is the Mediterranean, so are short and swarthy and stupid and criminal. And this nonsense theory led him to say that we know from the laws of genetics that there's a reversion to the lower form in any intermarriage. So therefore, a Nordic who marries an Alpine yields an Alpine as a child. And an Alpine who marries a Mediterranean will yield a Mediterranean. And any one of the three European groups that marries a Jew is a Jew. That at the very bottom of this, but along the way, he was knocking off a lot of other ethnic groups that he liked. So this, if you'll excuse the expression, bullshit theory, did take hold in politics, and it led, there were many other factors, but in 1924, to the most restrictive immigration law in US history, which changed the face of immigration and particularly of Jewish population in the US. I saw in the chat that somebody asked, were the Jews going to Argentina and Brazil at the same time? After 1924, it is almost certain, if you have Jewish relatives in Mexico, in Argentina, in Chile, as I do, that they couldn't get into the US after 1924, so they went there.
And I think,
Hasia, go ahead.
oh no, I was just going to add, I mean, the Immigration Restriction League and the eugenicists, which Dan cited, they were formative and, took as their strategy legislation. And that was what, so we're going to one by one, over time, press for more and more and more restrictive legislation. I think we can't underestimate also in the early 1920s, late 19 teens, the rise of the second Ku Klux Klan, which was the single largest reform organization in American history.
And they were not, I was just going to say, the KKK then, their targets were not Black people. Black people, the KKK, they didn't have any rights.
Right, that's what they were, right.
That they're no problem because we've suppressed them, we've repressed them. It's these newcomers, these Catholics and Jews.
Jews, absolutely. And it's just remarkable when you read the level of political power they gained, and not just in the sort of old Confederacy, but places like Maine, New Jersey, Oregon, even Long Island. And we even know somebody whose grandfather, the American people, know somebody whose grandfather lived on Long Island who was Klan affiliated. I won't mention his name, but he used to be president. I mean, they were incredibly powerful and were such a force in a way. Yeah, I mean, the Immigration Restriction League was at the top, but this was from the bottom.
Yeah.
And it's the meeting of these two powerful forces that really made for the legislation, which I think it changed the Jews, it changed America. I mean, it really was a decisive factor in making as it impacted the country.
Absolutely. From 1924 to 1965, that law doesn't disappear until 1965. So think, and this is where we get to the Holocaust inevitably, how many people in Europe would have come to the US, particularly as Nazism was arising, but could not come to the US.
Right.
We don't know how many, but we can guess it was a lot.
Yeah.
And how many of those died in the death camps? We know it was a lot because of this law.
Yeah, and by the mid 1930s in Poland, before a half decade before the German invasion, anti-Semitism had just escalated, and there's no reason to think that those millions of Polish Jews, they were frantically trying to get out. And that place that had been the biggest magnet, the most powerful magnet, was just now close to them. And yeah, they're going to Cuba and they're going to Mexico, but those places also had, took very small numbers. And world history would have been very different without that legislation. And it's one of those things that as a historian, you think, why didn't they know? Why didn't they do it? But obviously they couldn't know where this was going to lead.
So, we're talking about the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, and I'm assuming also the 1921 Emergency Quota Act. And I wonder, I know these were in reaction to Jewish immigrants and Catholic immigrants. So how did Jews who were already in the country react to these things? And to nativism and eugenics, and what did that reaction look like to people who were not recent immigrants?
I'll give you one small piece of it and then hand the ball over to Hasia. Politically, in Congress, if you read the debates in the congressional record that were taking place in 1921 for the Emergency Act, and then more so in 1924, the names of those who are against the act, those who want to keep immigration open, are not just Jewish names, like Emanuel Seller of Brooklyn, who really was, he was there for both the 1924 bill and the 1965, or Italian names, although half Jewish, Fiorello LaGuardia. They were both very passionately trying to keep the doors open, but Irish names as well, and Polish names, which is to say, even those who had no political or ethnic affiliation, but were themselves the children of immigrants, that was the party, that was the group that opposed the immigration law.
And they were terribly in the minority. But your question is a really good one. And so, the let's call them the established Jews in the United States. I mean, they're not, I don't know what that exactly means, but the people who have voice, I mean, they are going to court. They are taking the cases of people who are detained or being disbarred. A lawyer like Max Kohler, Louis Marshall, who dies in 1929, but they are on the kind of barricades. And what they're essentially saying is, Celia Rozotsky as well, from the National Council of Jewish Women, we are powerless in the face of this legislative juggernaut. They're winning, but case by case by case, they try to intercede for individual immigrants and individual immigrant families. And they're constantly making the case. They band together with Irish, with Protestants of goodwill, to have all sorts of community activities to say, look how much immigrants have given to us, with a hope that maybe this would reverse the course. And it's one of those really tragic, obviously my bias coming out, of rearguard action that they were unable to stop because their numbers were, in this sense, so small. And when the laws go 21 and 24 go through Congress, it's really a very small number who vote against it.
Yeah,
so so who, what is it they could do? And again, they were active, they were frantic, they were assertive, and then nothing else was within their sort of quiver. They had no other arrows in their quiver. And also I do want to say that it was American Jews who founded the Joint during World War I, and in the 30s with the antisemitism in Poland and then the rise of Nazism. It's the Joint that is out there going around the world looking for places for Jews to go, Shanghai, Kenya, wherever. And so in a way you could say that American Jewish elite money and political effort, once they recognized they couldn't do anything about the United States, was about finding alternative homelands or alternative places of refuge.
I know we're running out of time, but just to insert one, I think, important fact that I left out before, the 1924 Act determined who could come into America based on absolutely outrageously and dishonestly conceived formula. So that the consequence for the Jews were, up until that year, there had been not counting World War I, where there was not a lot of immigration for obvious reasons, I think it was 95,000 Eastern European Jews coming to the country every year. The quota put on Jews, it changed a little bit over the years. It was between 5,000 and 6,000. So that's 90,000 a year, right?
If I could only slightly so remember, there are no Jewish quotas. Right. There are quotas by country. And so there's a quota for Poland. There's a quota for this place, Lithuania, for a while, it's an independent country. And so, and again, I think it's really important to note that Jews had no more or no less opportunity to get on that quota, to fill a quota, than a Christian from the same country.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, because I think it's something that a lot of Jewish communal audiences kind of think, well, it was about Jews. That now it may have been in the backs of their heads, even though obviously Italians and Greeks get such a low quota.
Yeah, I would say it was about Jews in the sense that, yeah, there might be some Protestants suffering as well, but that's not as important as keeping the Jews out.
Right. Yeah. But the Polish quota is a Polish quota, and it's from Poland, and that's what you get. And Polish Catholics don't have any better chance. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a really important caveat, as it were.
So I think we're going to move into audience questions for a bit. So the first question is, can you talk about what U.S. immigration authorities required from immigrants to enter in the U.S.? Like, did they need a sponsor, financial support? What did that look like in the time period that we're discussing?
Well, until the 1890s, pretty much nothing. There were no restrictions, and then they start adding certain health categories, questions about criminality. Then there's a mental. They institute a head tax.
About LPC.
LPC likely to become a public charge, and so there's a certain amount of interrogation. And over time, the number of categories get more and more extensive, and shall we say, the supervision and the surveillance becomes more sophisticated. So in the earlier years, it's easier to say, yeah, I'm a tailor, and you go through. But if you have, once they do the health exams, do you have a contagious disease? Do you have some kind of eye condition? Sunken, all sorts of categories. And at some point, yes, is there somebody, the LPC, is there somebody who's going to vouch for you or who will take care of you? And so you have to give a name of somebody you know. So so the question really is to be answered by when you're talking about.
Yeah.
Different and harsher as time went on.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Dan.
I just noticed a question that's in the chat that seems pertinent to this, and now I've lost where it was, so I'm going to cede the floor back to you while I look.
Okay. I am actually going to ask one that just came in the chat. Can you talk a bit more about the conscription of Jews into the Russian army in the early 1900s, and if that propelled Jews and others to leave at all?
Yeah, so the really harshest conscription ends in the 1870s. So it's not that it ended, but it became less targeted at Jews, and it was no longer that 25-year period that had been the case at the in the latter quarter of the 1860s and 70s. I think in the end, it's still economics that's drawing people to Jews and other immigrants to the possibilities of the United States.
I found the question. It was, does that mean the listener or the viewer asks that my parents got here before 1924. Does that mean that that their family members couldn't come as well? Well, in fact, their family members could come. My mother came under that doctrine that if you had an American citizen on this side of the water, you could get it. Interestingly, in 1965, when this is repealed, when the act is replaced, one of the key elements of it was the argument put forward by a conservative congressman from Ohio named Fagan, Irish, who wanted to make certain that relatives of relatives of relatives of relatives could continue to come because he thought they were all going to be Irish.
Right.
Or they were all going to be at least white.
White, yeah.
What he did not anticipate, this did make it into the 1965 Hart-Celler Act. What he did not anticipate is that also applied to people from the Dominican Republic. It applied to people from Africa and from all over the world. The immigrants who began to come in on the so-called, what the right-wing anti-immigration people call chain migration, were largely not what Congressman Fagan expected.
Right. I remember most immigrants beforehand were also chain migrants. Yeah, I mean, that was the mechanism, that somebody comes from your family, sends money over to pay the fare of the wife, the cousin, the nephew, and they, as the word says, they kind of, sort of brought each one is a link in a chain that reconstituted families in the United States. It's just the earlier chain migrants were not what Fagan was thinking about.
Yep.
So I don't know if this is something you both feel sort of comfortable talking about, but we have a question that asks, how are nativist and anti-immigration movements of today similar to and different from the ones in the 1920s?
Well, I think they're profoundly similar, and the same. In addition to people who are simply racist or anti-Semitic or anti-Catholic, there are strong economic interests as well. Big business then and big business now kind of liked immigration because it was lower paid workers. Unions, Samuel Gompers himself, an immigrant, they wanted to cut immigration because it was people coming in who were undercutting the wages that their union workers were earning. That's gone. I think that's but the sheer ethnic hatred and resentment. Now you can't say it out loud, although each day passes, they're beginning to say it more loudly. But it's in a way it's been euphemized. It's been heavily euphemized, so that it's really given a certain son of a former KKK member from Long Island. Maybe I should say it's not being euphemized anymore. I think they're very close.
Yeah, and in fact, there's something sort of deja vu-y over as a historian of immigration. And you read what the people are saying now, and it could be the Know Nothing Party, in the 1840s and 50s, talking about the Irish. They'll never become American. They have dual loyalties. They belong to a church that is not fit for democracy, which is what's said about Muslims. They work for lower wages. They depress the American standard of living. I've heard all this before, and it's just slightly new adjectives, slightly new, but it's almost like frighteningly boring as rhetoric because we've heard it, and
Hasia, I've always maintained that there's a sine wave in American history. And there are these periods, usually periods of economic hardship, particularly when immigration goes up and anti-immigrant feeling rises, and then it dips. Do you think there's a possibility of a dip from this one?
Oh, I'll tell you what, I'm the world's biggest pessimist. So I don't ask me. Ask somebody who has a more optimistic view of everything. I feel we have dug ourselves into just a really horrendous reality, and it comes from the top down. And I don't know. I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, I hope so too.
So we are almost out of time, but I do want to give either of you the chance to say any final thoughts before we go.
My only final thought comes directly from what Hasia and I have just been talking about, is that if you have an impulse of looking at the Mexican border and thinking we can't let these people in, and I don't think the border should be totally open. There are all sorts of reasons. Just remember your grandparents and your great-grandparents, because they were looked at exactly the same way.
Absolutely. And I don't ordinarily say, I'm going to say this as a Jew. I'm here speaking as a historian, but Jews suffered from the same rhetoric and the same actions that are being to which people are being subjected now. And I think it's our moral responsibility to side with the people coming in and to side with those standing for office who have an expansive view that essentially everybody can become an American.
Great.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been such an amazing conversation. I could listen to you both talk forever, but unfortunately we don't have time. I do also want to thank all of you out there in the internet who have joined us today. And just to say that everything we do at the museum is made possible through donor support. And to those of you watching, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum and becoming a member. And also joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can check out on our website. Thank you again to Hasia and Dan. Have a great afternoon.
It's been my
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.
Our
Bye-bye.
pleasure. Yeah.
Bye, Hasia.